Hey class, in this video we'll be adding a background into our Godot project, and we're going to be creating a seamless background. So that's a background that we can repeat multiple times in the scene, and we won't see where that repeat happens. And so there's a specific way that we can go about making that work. I'm going to go over one technique using Piskel, but there's a lot of different ways to do it, so feel free to try different things. Once we get the art, we'll go into Godot and set up what's called a parallax background. And so that's a background that moves at a different rate than the rest of the scene, which will add a nice effect of some depth in our scene. You've probably seen this before in other 2D games that you may have played. So once we do that, we will do some documentation and post on the Open Lab. So let's get started. So we'll start in Piskel and just design a background to use in our game. I'm going to do something pretty simple. I'm just going to draw some mountains. And so to start off, I want to set up the grid, and we can see our grid default is set to be 8 pixels. But I want to make this art a little bigger because it's going to fill in the background of my game. So I'm going to change the art to 256 by 256. That's still not actually as big as our game window, but we are going to size it up. And since it's pixel art, that'll be fine. So I'm just going to design at 256 by 256. And then I'm going to go back and adjust the grid to 64 by 64. So now we can kind of see something that looks a little closer to how our game window will look. So let's save this now that we've got this set up as background, and we'll put it in a new backgrounds folder. And so my first frame, I'm just going to set up a couple guides. So I'm going to draw on this sort of top grid line and then the bottom grid line. So my game window is twice as wide as it is tall. And so I want to recreate the same thing here, but my art is going to go a little bit above and below the game window. And we'll see how that'll look once we put it into Godot. I'm also going to be setting up the art so that it's seamless, so that it repeats multiple times in our scene. So let's start just by drawing in our mountains. I'm just going to choose a green color and kind of draw the top of the mountains. And then I'm going to fill that in with a lighter green. And I'm not going to do anything too sophisticated here. I could add some shading or something like that. But most of this demo is just about creating the background. So now that I have the mountains, I'm just going to fill in the top of the background with a light blue for the sky. So I'm just going to stop there, and then I'm going to make my seamless background. So I'm going to grab the move tool, and I have to hold Option for this to work. You can see as I hold Option and drag the mountains, you can see they wrap around. And the thing that's cool about that is now I know for certain that the left side and the right side will match because they were formerly sitting right next to each other. And now we've just kind of divided them. And now we have this kind of like weird gap in the middle, but we can just draw over that to fix it. And now we'll have some seamless mountains. So that's a really easy way to create a seamless pattern. It's pretty basic, but it will repeat, and we shouldn't notice when it repeats. So one thing we can do to make our pattern a little bit more interesting is add layers. And you can add as many layers as you want. If you look at some games that use similar techniques, you might see that they have like tons of different little layers with different details on them. I'm just going to create one just for the sake of the demo. So I'm going to create a new frame and draw some more mountains. And this time I'm going to fill in the green mountains, but I'm going to leave out the blue sky, because these are going to be in front of our first set of mountains, and so we don't want to cover them up with the blue sky. So I'm going to use the move tool again and wrap these around and find something that looks good. And so once you've got it in a place that you like, you can see we still have that break in between the mountains, so we need to kind of fill that in. This looks a little bit weird, but it's good enough for the sake of the demo. Be careful, because if you don't hold Option and you move the art, you'll actually lose some of that art, but you can just undo it. So now I'm going to kind of move these guys around a little bit to line them up with the mountains in the back. And once I get that where I like it, I need to just fill in that little bottom gap. And so now we've got the setup we want. Let's export our sprite sheet, and we're going to use the sprite, so we'll be able to choose the 2 different frames. So I can just export both of these frames. Of course, I want to delete the guides that I created for the first frame. And then I also want to increase the scale. So we want to make sure that this fills in our whole game window. And the game window for my game is 1024 by 512. You don't have to use the same size, but if you do, that'll make it a little bit easier. Just use 1024 by 512. And so I want to make sure that the width of my sprite sheet is 1024. I don't really care about the height as much. We do want the height to be greater than 512, and I just have it at 1024, so that's a little bit easier. But as long as it's bigger, or at least the same size as the height, we can work with that. Basically, as long as the width is the same size or greater, and the height is the same size or greater as the game window, you should be fine for this one. So once we've got that set up, we just want to export our PNG sprite sheet. So I'll click download and find my artist folder and then put it in the backgrounds folder. So once I've got my sprite sheet, I'm going to go to my Godot project. And you probably have a project that you've already started, so you should just go ahead and work in there. But if not, you can always download the artist default, or if you're missing something, you can download the assets folder. So either way, whether you're using your own game or the artist default project, we just need to add the image into the sprites folder. So let's go to the backgrounds folder and copy background.png and paste it into the sprites folder. So once we've got the artist default project open, we can open up the default scene, and we just have a simple scene here with some platforms and our player. And so let's first duplicate those platforms and drag them over here. So I'm just going to duplicate the whole tile map and drag it over, so I have a little more space so we can actually see that background work. And then we can see our scene working. So now it's time to add in our background, and we need a special layer for this. This is called a parallax layer. And what this does is it moves at a different speed than the rest of our scene. The scene has a default canvas where it's drawing everything, but all that stuff is being drawn where the camera that's attached to our player is moving. And we want this to move at a different pace. So we create a whole new canvas layer. And we can do that using a parallax background. And so once we've got that, we need to add in a parallax layer. And the parallax layer allows us to have multiple layers moving at different speeds. And so that's how we can kind of create this illusion of depth that we're going for with this parallax background. So our parallax layer needs a sprite to put our mountain sprite in. And before I add that in, I'm just going to duplicate this whole thing because we know we have two layers, but they're going to have different settings. So I want to go ahead and duplicate this so we have that set up. So our first parallax layer will have our first background with the blue sky. And so I'm going to grab that sprite and click on the texture and then load in my background texture. And you can see we see both frames because it's a sprite sheet. So we just need to go into our sprite and open up the animation properties and then change the vertical frames to 2 because there's 2 vertical frames. And so now we'll see just that first image for our background. So now we've got our sprite in there and that looks pretty good. And so let's take a look at that. And so we can see the background, but we also see that it moves with the player. And then when we get to the edge, you see the edge of the background. And so we want to change that. So we can go to the parallax layer and look at the motion properties. And you can see that the motion scale on X and Y is both 1. And so that means it's going to move at the same rate as the rest of our scene. And so if we set those to 0, now we'll see that it doesn't move at all. It's just a completely static background. And that might work if you have like something kind of abstract, but it does look a little weird that the mountains are moving at the exact same pace as the character. And so we don't want that. So let's just add a little bit of motion. So let's make the scale of the X motion 0.25. And so the background mountains will move, but they'll move more slowly. And so it'll make it look like they're farther in the distance. And for the Y, we'll do just 0.1 because we're mostly moving right and left in this platformer style scene. If you're working with something that uses a lot of vertical movement, you could kind of reverse this whole setup and repeat things going upwards. But since I'm working mostly with horizontal movement in this platformer style game, I'm going to make the Y motion sort of smaller than the X motion. And this is a ratio of the motion of the rest of the scene. So we're not setting like the speed of the player, but we're just setting a ratio to what's happening in the rest of the scene. So 1 is kind of the default that the player is moving at. And if we do a fraction of 1, then it'll go slower. If we do above 1, then it'll go faster. So then we want to repeat the background. And so what we can do is turn mirroring on. And since we made this seamless background, you'll see that when I set the mirroring on X to 1024, now we see 2 copies of the background in the editor view. But if I go into my game, we can see that the background isn't actually set up correctly. We can see the edge of it. And that's because our camera is actually offset in the scene since it's following the player, and the player starts in the middle of our scene. So we could change that setup, but it's easy just to move this layer. So let's go to the Node 2D transform and change the X position to 512, which is half of the width of the window. And that works because our camera is centered on our player. And so now we have a seamless background. When the player gets to the edge, we repeat the mountains. So that looks pretty good. Let's move on to our second parallax layer, and we're just going to repeat basically the same process. So we'll take the sprite and load in our sprite sheet. And we have to change the vertical frames to 2 again. And then we're just going to select the second frame. So we'll get the second frame of our sprite sheet, which is our mountains with the transparent sky. And so now we have our foreground and our background. And so we're going to change the scale of the motion. I'm just going to make it slightly faster than the background. Since those foreground mountains are a little bit closer to us, their movement will be a little bit closer to our movement. So we'll change that motion scale on X to 0.3. And then for the Y, I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger. So again, we're not using the vertical space quite as much. So I don't want to have as dramatic changes in the vertical space. So then I'll just set the mirroring to 1024 and the position to 512 just to match the settings of the background. And so now that looks pretty good. We get this kind of illusion of motion, of distance with these different layers. So within a 2D game, this is a way that we can kind of create depth. And it's also nice because we don't have to draw like a really, really long background. We can just repeat this one background that we have, but that kind of motion makes it look a little bit more realistic. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time tweaking this, but the mountains are supposed to be in the background. So I think the 0.15 is a bit too dramatic. I'm going to try 0.11. So this is just a demo. I didn't really spend a lot of time on the mountains. You could probably put a lot more detail. You could also make something a little bit more interesting than mountains. But whatever you want to do for your game, spend a little bit of time making that look good. So this is everything that I wanted to show in this demo. Let's go ahead and take a couple screenshots. And once we've got those, we can go over to the Open Lab and create a new post. And so as usual, we got to find the category so we can search for backgrounds under artist, and then we can add my backgrounds. And we want to make sure to show both of our documentation in Godot as well as the original art that we created. So usually I put in the sprites first, but this time I put in the Godot screenshots first, which is fine, doesn't really matter. And I tried putting this in as a gallery. There's some cool options you can do there. Like you can change the number of columns and stuff like that. So that could be kind of cool if you have like a bunch of images. I didn't really put them in any particular order, but we can kind of see that the background changes in these different images. So that looks kind of cool. I kind of want to see the details. So I'm actually just going to change the columns to 1. And so that's fine. It's kind of like I just threw them in there, but it's still using a gallery. So that's kind of cool. Doesn't really matter. As long as you've got the documentation and it looks good, that's fine. So then let's throw in the original sprite sheet. So you could share this with another student if you want to collaborate. If they like your background and they want to use it in your game, you can share it using this. You can also zip it up and send it to them on Discord or something like that, however you guys want to do it. So that looks pretty good. Let's preview our post again. And so we've got everything we need in there. Looks good. So let's go ahead and publish.